So you'll see the title that agreed with Bill, Leading Intercessions Well, and encouraging others to join in, hopefully, as well. That may be something that you find in church isn't so easy. Bill said I'll introduce myself. So, yes, I have been here about 9 years now. John Hibberd, I'm Mission Development Advisor, one of, mostly in this archdeaconry, Sheffield and Rotherham, but also now look after the Renewed, the prayer strategy part of the prayer part of the strategy, which I guess is why I've got this gig, as it were, to talk about prayer, and very, very pleased to do that. I'd put on my notes, pray, because, you think, well, you can't really do an evening on prayer without praying, but Bill's beaten me to it, so that's great. I'm very tempted to say, actually, in one sense, we've done the most important part this evening already, which is to pray, which is to come to God in prayer. The rest of it's sort of discussion and whatever, and that's important too. But we've already prayed. And that might seem like, oh, that was kind of just the introduction. Well, yes and no. I think for me, one of the things that will come out is that that's a really important part of what we do. A quick overview of the first half this evening. Bill says there's a gap. So this is the kind of input bit. You'll see I'll put your questions. We'll come to that in a minute. Something then about valuing the intercessions. We're going to think about different resources, being creative, some do's and don'ts, and encouraging how can we get other people involved, because that you may have come with that sort of angle to things. But I thought we'd actually start with your questions. So, I can talk about how to lead intercessions well, but if it's not actually answering the questions that you've got, then that's a less useful kind of evening. So you'll see I put on here, say 3 minutes just in your tables. What are some of the things that you're looking for from an evening on how to lead intercessions well? I've found one sheet of paper that's got some blank space on it, so I will scribble down any questions on here. It may be that a lot of them will be addressed in what I've got to say, but if they aren't, then we'll look at that list at the beginning of the second half, and if there's anything we haven't handled, we'll return to it. So over to you for 3 minutes in your groups. So, what sort of questions or issues have you got about the intercessions? I've let them go. Guys, are we enjoying that together? What sort of things were you talking about that you'd like to see addressed?
We've been talking about relevance.
Relevance?
Relevant to the people that are praying.
Right. Okay, yeah.
A little bit on sort of duration as well, which can be a sensitive issue.
Yeah, duration. Yeah. That's a touchy issue for any part of the service, isn't it? Yeah. That service went 1 minute over the hour. I'm never coming again.
We've got some Nigerian people, and they have a very different style of extempore.
Oh, different cultures. Oh, I definitely haven't got that in my talk. Oh, that's a good point. We had someone come to preach when I was a curate who was from Indonesia, and he gave this long introduction, and then he to the sermon. He said, "Now then," he said, I got 20 minutes. Is that right?" I thought, well, you've had about 5 already, and I said 15. But never mind, I was enjoying it.
John.
Yeah.
One of the things that we sometimes discuss is content.
Yeah.
Of prayers. Some people have preferences, or their main point is probably different to someone else. So content we discuss occasionally.
Right. So it's kind of a bit possibly with relevance, isn't it? What's the actual content? How does it relate to people? Yeah, we're definitely going to cover that. Yeah. Okay.
We talked about in the grand word theology that sometimes somebody will pray something fairly fervently from the front, but you actually think, oh, I'm not sure where I sit on that particular thing, but it's that kind of, so it's how to make sure that the prayers are prayers that the church can say amen to, really, rather than quite often done that you worry is not where we should.
This one's even better than duration, isn't it? I'll just put theology. I could put dodgy stroke sound or whatever, because one person's dodgy is another person's sound. There is something, isn't there, about leading prayers on behalf of people. You do have to think about. I'm sorry, I have to make this parallel, but I used to have a reader when I was a kid. Well, we had several readers, but one of them, it was when he was preaching or when he was doing prayers, it would be go, here comes another one. One of the hobby horses has come out the stable. And there was perhaps nothing wrong with the theme, but it was always there. And you're thinking, let it go, man. But anyway, go on, good point. Yeah, I'm not sure whether I cover that one, but we can come back to that. Yeah.
Just put hobby horses.
Yeah, well, theology's fine. Yeah, other things?
I'm interested to know why many people are reluctant to read Intercessions.
Yeah, why people won't do it? Yeah.
How as readers we can motivate people.
We are definitely going to look at that. Yeah.
I got that down here, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Pray.
Yeah. Yeah.
We had praying for long lists of names.
Lists of names, that's definitely going to come up as well.
And related to that in some ways, how much silence to build in.
Silence, yeah. Definitely got that as well.
Written prayers or pre-written prayers or extempore prayers.
Okay, so whether you write them or just go for it. Yeah.
Because there's different churches do it.
Yeah. I'm not sure I cover that, but I think an immediate sort of reaction would be that's partly something to do with the comfort of the person leading, isn't it? There's some people who, in all honesty, if you just said to them, don't worry about paper, just go up there, it would be a disaster, because they can't. Whereas if they can do it in advance, they'll actually produce some sensible, helpful sort of content that they feel confident to deliver. So I don't really mind that. I can think of somebody in our church who always goes up with a very nicely written prayer, Sue or now I'm talking about, and they're always good prayers, nothing wrong with them at all. But if I was there, I'd usually just get dumped in it at the last minute if I'm a visiting preacher. We've got nobody to do the prayers, will you do them? Yeah, you don't usually. Go on, one more.
Refrain in the prayers.
The refrain, yeah.
Sort of pattern, I suppose.
Yeah, we'll definitely come to that. That is an F. Not retrain.
The length of prayers.
We got duration, yeah. So we got a couple on that, yeah. Okay, Sue.
I would like to know if you're going to tackle kinesthetic prayer, interactive prayer.
Yeah. I'll put interactive. It's easy to spell. Okay. Right, so I don't hang myself. I think I'm going to call a stop to it there. Otherwise, I shall have far too many things to answer. Let's go on to my... you don't need to applaud. That's just a visual. Let's hear it for the intercessions. Recovering a sense of their value, I thought, first of all, was important. Because it often feels to me that intercessions in the service are a poor relation. I've put 3 images up here. So some people, when they come to church, the key thing for them is the preaching, is the sermon, the readings, the ministry of the word. That's what they really want to see. For others, it's the sacraments, principally bread and wine, but there are other sacraments are available, as they say. And then there's for others, it's the what they call the worship, by which they mean the singing. So whether that's choir, as it is in the picture, or whether it's music group. We had a lovely thing when we were at college. There was a great debate because they used to talk about the worship before the service, which used to send the worship lecturers ballistic because his point was that the whole service is worship. So we used to call it pre-worship worship, by which we meant singing. But it's interesting, isn't it? Those three things are really high-profile things in the service. And at times, the intercessions and one or two other little bits can feel like just fillers, really, to some people. I'm sure they don't value them as much as they should. I was going to say the intercessions are rather unsung, but that's perhaps an unhelpful pun after worship. So I put up this verse. I mean, it was great, the Bible reading we had from Bill about persistence in prayer. I love that passage. But 1 Timothy 2:1, I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession and thanksgiving be made for all people. First of all, meaning first in priority. Prayer isn't some secondary part of our worship. It's right up there at the forefront. And 4 words for prayer that are in here that overlap. So mustn't make too much of these distinctions, but petition and request, that's a word which arises from that fundamental sense of a need of God. You know, we need God to move in answer to this request. Prayers here is used in the sense of approaching God, coming to God because God is the only one who can satisfy these needs. Intercession came to be linked to meaning entering the presence of a king. That's the privilege that we have, the access that we have through Jesus, and that gives us a calling to intercede for the world. That's interesting that it says here, it says prayers for all people, not just for the church. Sometimes I think our praying can become very insular, we can become very church-oriented, and we need to remember that when we meet together to pray, part of the work that we're doing as the people of God, part of the sense of being involved in extending God's kingdom, is our intercession for the world. And then we've got thanksgiving. And just a thought, really. I was thinking about this. I mean, I probably have not analysed it carefully enough, but it seems to me that quite often when I hear the intercessions, there's not a strong note of thanksgiving. I don't need to explain what thanksgiving is. It's pretty obvious. But it quite often isn't there. There's just lots of, we want this, we want that, please do this, please do that. And you think that's maybe something, just a simple thing that we ought to pick up on a little bit more. But this one verse stands really in line with what we see the New Testament church saying, that prayer is so important and first in their corporate and individual life together. So what I'm trying to do here is say, here's an impetus, here's an encouragement for us. When we're thinking about the intercessions, think, hang on a minute, this is something really important. If you're leading the service, which I'm guessing sometimes as readers you're leading the whole thing, the intercessions come in the context of all that. So how do you pray at other points in the service? Whether it's that, if you're using that prayer at the beginning about entering into God's presence, or you're leading the confession, or different bits of the service, it seems to me that the way you do that kind of sets a tone for the whole thing. Is there a sense that prayer is alive, is vital, is real for you? Do you introduce those prayers? Or are you one of those sorts of people who hates introductions? You just want the person to read what's on the sheet and nothing more, nothing less. There's differing opinions on that, of course. I tend to favour more thinking, well, if I'm introducing the confession, I want to give people space. I want to say, let's actually just hold some quiet to think about the things we want to bring, and then use the words of the liturgy. But I know for other people, they go, no, that's a waste of time. You're totally unnecessary. But there's still ways of doing it, which I think are good and kind of set a tone so when we get to the intercessions, there's that sense of expectancy and so on. Going to think about resources at your disposal. It's not all limb hop. Interestingly, when Bill did the prayers at the beginning, Lord, in your mercy, and as all good Anglicans do, hear our prayer. You know, you could virtually do it in your sleep, couldn't you? When I was a curate, I used to write this if I was writing out service orders. I put limb hop, and then you kind of knew what was coming next. But there are other options. So, I mean, that's the first thing to say. Somebody said about, where is it? Sort of resources, yeah, different interactive bits. So probably you've used Lord hear us, Lord graciously hear us. I thought, well, I'll stick that one up because it's probably well known, but there are others. There's quite a few things, and I've sent Bill the PDF of this, so I don't know if you normally send these round, but you can. That's the page where there's loads and loads of different things. I found, for example, one of the seasonal ones for Advent, Maranatha, and then Amen, come Lord Jesus, as the response. Some people will sort of think, well, you know, I'd rather just stick with it, or the congregation won't tolerate any change from what's written in the service book or whatever. But personally, I think it's helpful to do different responses. And in a minute, I'll come to something about how to do those, perhaps in a good way. We also have diocesan resources in prayer, so that's worth being aware of. That's the web page. The menu on the right-hand side is what you would see on that web page. So you'll find different aspects, and there's under the bottom one, prayer, worship and prayer resources, there's quite a lot of things. They're not all mine by any means. I look after this page, but they've come from all over the place, all sorts of different things. And, you know, if you're thinking, oh, I'm a bit stuck, well, have a look there. I have flagged up calendar of intercessions. In our calendar of intercessions, we pray for every parish, so for a start, and its people. We keep an eye on the diocesan diary, so anything that's actually happening would all be in there. There's other themes in the wider world. And it just struck me a few struggles sometimes for content, where you're thinking, what can we do that's happening at the moment? You know, if you think, oh, we'd like to pray for the diocese, you know, rather than just saying, oh, we pray for the bishops in our diocese and that all would be hunky-dory. You sort of think, well, I wonder what's happening in the diocese. Well, that would tell you the answer. And you could pray for things. On today's calendar of intercessions, partly because I write it, is this meeting. Because you think, well, this is happening. It's open to all the readers in our diocese. It's worth praying for. And I've put the vision prayer on there. We actually use it at most weeks in church. We use it quite often in the intercessions. Sometimes it's somewhere else. I have encountered churches that have used it as a post-communion prayer. The cathedral were doing that for a while, but I don't know whether they do now because of change of dean and so on. So what about being creative? So I thought about special Sundays, first of all. So remembrance. I think remembrance is quite tricky for prayer, because you've probably got quite a lot of people in who are not normally there. And it's just got a particular tone, hasn't it? It's got a particular atmosphere. But the good news is there's lots of resources out there. So I often just use, well, if I'm doing the intercessions, I would just use those, actually. And if I'm doing our church, then I'm probably not doing them. And the people who do them are very good at this. They have a sort of sense of the occasion and everything else. But Churches Together in Britain, Ireland and British Legion produce some great stuff for remembrance. Carols and Christmas, I've put, think about who's there who doesn't normally come to church. It makes me slightly cringe when I go to a service where I can tell there's lots of people who are not usually there, and the intercessions are kind of, you think, well, I'm guessing this is how they're done every week. And maybe it's quite hard for someone who's not usually there to get into that. But with a little bit of tweaking, you could probably make those intercessions more accessible to people who are not usually in church. So, for example, just thinking about if there are big things happening in the news, really they've got to be in that week, haven't they? But they've got to be well chosen. And it might depend whether it's, more all-agey or whatever, and we'll come to that. You could apply this to things like services where there's, if you've got baptism service that's in the main service, for example, again, you're going to have a lot of people who are not normally there. How do you make the intercessions duration? How do you make them not interminable for somebody who's thinking, well, they've all got their heads down, and how long's this bit going to go on for? That might be how they feel if they're not used to church. Themed Sundays, there's quite a lot of these, which quite a lot of the time we don't necessarily observe. I guess in your churches, do you bother much with the themed Sundays? I'm not talking about Christmas and Easter, obviously you do those, but some of these things.
Some of them I do.
Yeah.
If it's Christian Aid Week or...
Yeah. And again, a lot of them do produce resources. So there's quite a lot you can do there. Some of these resources are not necessarily Anglican. Now, I'm being recorded, so I have to be a bit careful here. Personally, I'd still use them. I don't think there's any particular... I don't think you're going against your anything you've sworn to do by doing that. And actually, quite a lot of them are often approved by churches together in Britain and Ireland anyway. So they're just more ecumenical resources. If they help people to pray, at the end of the day, for me, that's the most important thing. Music or images. These will only work, of course, if you've got the tech, you've got the setup to do it. But quite a lot of churches do. And if you do have it, then I would say use it. It can really help. You don't necessarily, of course, have to have the tech to use music. Lots of people have used the Teze chant, "O Lord, hear my prayer." Some of you are probably groaning inwardly as I say it, and others of you are thinking, oh yes, I love that. Other chants, again, are available. But it's that sort of thing that can just make it a little bit different from time to time. I think I suppose some people will say, oh, I don't like anything different. I just like to have the same thing every week, and that's perfectly okay. But my gut reaction is that I think a lot of people, it helps them if there is a bit of variety in the diet, and actually it helps them to see that prayer isn't fixed or dull or whatever, but can be interesting. Images can be really helpful with things like praying for climate crisis. Bill asked me to talk about that, and I will in the second half. But news things, sometimes you can just put up an image, and somebody said earlier in the questions about using silence, and just to say to people, just use that image to help you to pray for that situation. And I think there's a great advantage in that, because you're getting people to engage in prayer for themselves rather than just somebody say some words for them, which again can be good. I don't know whether, I hope we've got sound. I didn't check that. I have got a prayer which I use not in Intercessions, but used it in New Year. It was just a simple search on the internet, found this prayer, and it's about, 3-4 minutes. then I've put on here all age worship. So one of the things about prayer is we don't have to always be kneeling down, although I have to say I find kneeling, maybe you'll correct me on this, but I find kneeling a rarer event these days. I think it's because the church has got older and most people, if they go down, they'll never get up again.
Sorry, John, very quickly.
Yeah.
I mentioned at church a few weeks back, mother with a child doing the prayers and they were kneeling down. And the child has to says to the mother, "Why are people hiding?"
Hiding, yeah. They're all doing this thing, are they? Yeah. So prayer can be more physical. What was the word we had? No, interactive, kinesthetic, somebody said. Doesn't have to be just sitting there. So you'll know probably that Jewish people used to stand with their arms in the air was a typical posture for praying, that real sort of sense of supplication towards God. So prayer stations, not always practical in some churches if you've got lots of pews and things, but no reason, particularly if you're having all age, why people can't move round and actually do things. Or maybe you can put things on a screen, so it's a bit like going around prayer station if you've got a lot of people who don't move so easily. The paper planes is probably at the extreme end of entertainment value for prayers, but writing a prayer on a plane and then throwing it to a particular place, for some people that will be absolutely anathema, but for a lot of kids it's a lot of fun. And it's only the same principle as doing things like, putting a stone in water or lighting a candle, or whatever it is. It's actually doing something physical. The prayer tree, we have a prayer tree at the moment in church. This one I actually found on a website, and this is pushing the boundaries a bit further. If you hover over the tags, the prayer comes up on the website. I thought that's very clever. Or you have to think whether you want to do that on a website, obviously, of course. But a simple prayer tree in a church can be very good because you can use it after the service as well. You can say to people, "There's the prayer tree."
We found the prayer tree one of the best ways of encouraging people to get up and write a prayer.
Yeah.
And it's been really, really successful.
Yeah. But it's just showing there's lots of different ways, I think, of doing prayers. And you don't want to, if you did something different every week, people's heads would be spinning round. But if you did something slightly different once a month, they could probably cope with that, and it actually gets them thinking. In my Curacy church, we started offering something very different once a month. We did a teaching series on prayer for healing. This is in a fairly traditional high church, really, and prepared people for what we were going to do. And then once a month, instead of the intercessions, we offered prayer for healing. Now, some people say, "Oh, we don't want to do that." Well, that's fine. You can just invite people up during communion or something like that. But we felt we needed to make space for it if we were going to do it well. And then we actually also did a series on hearing from God. And then we would then combine that with encouraging people to say, well, does anybody have a picture or a word or whatever for people? And sometimes then those two things came together. So again, quite different. Some do's and don'ts. I've put in for a penny, in for a pound, because you might not agree with some of these. The do's are probably all right. So relevance, be informed. Never take the chance, if you're doing the intercessions, of not watching the news or looking at the news on a website before you go to church. Imagine you go to church on the morning when Prince Diana died and you're the one person who doesn't know and you're doing the intercessions, for example, just to take a really obvious story. So I think that's important. Pray like you expect that prayer is important if you're leading intercession. Don't sort of mumble your way through it and, sound like you're not really imagining it's going to make any difference. Explore variety. I mean, I've put variety or not. As you'll already tell, I would argue for variety, because I think we can get stale very easily. If you're going to use new responses, repeat them immediately. I'm sure you'll have had this experience. Somebody says, you know, well, the prayers will be, thank you, Lord, for all that you give to us. And then they go off into the first section, and then they go, thank you, Lord. And you're thinking, oh, what did they say? And it's only been 30 seconds, well, it's been a minute, and you can't remember, can you? Whereas if they say the response is going to be, thank you, Lord, for all you've given us, then they go, thank you, Lord, and you go, for all you've given us, it's in, and it stays. So simple, but it makes all the difference. And I have to say, I've been on the other end of this, and I think, oh, I don't know what they said, you know, and it's so embarrassing. Silence, somebody asked about. I would say be brave enough to use silence, because it encourages people to join in. If I go to a church where people say, and this is not your church, because I know that people who do lead intercessions in your church, I've just been caught once or twice, but I'll go to a church, they say, oh, we've got nobody who does the intercessions. I think, what? So what I will usually do then is I'll do a bidding prayer with some hints, and then I'll leave time for silence. And I'll say to them, pray for whatever of those things is on your heart. And then round it off with one of the usual responses, and then go on to the next bit. Because at the end of the day, you're engaging people. And it forces them to realise that actually when we come to the intercessions, we all pray, even if there is only one person voicing it. Some don'ts, which I might get into more trouble for. Don't perform. Well, what I put here is, don't be tempted to show erudition. See what I did there? I mean, we don't want, in a sense, those prayers that are really, really clever. I don't mean dumb it down, but what I think is one of the reasons why people are afraid to come forward is they think I cannot live up to the 2 or 3 people who do the prayers in our church. They're so good. They're so far beyond where I'm at. You know, it would just be a disaster, embarrassing if I went forward. So I have to be really careful about that. And then I've put, soapbox. I put, have you ever been on the end of prayers that are not directed to God, but are advice to the congregation? The intercessions, by definition, are addressed to God. And yet so often we can sort of slip into preaching. Don't do it. And actually don't give God advice either. Try to think about the way things are phrased so that you're asking God for things rather than saying, you know, telling God what to do. Jargon is a tricky one because it's hard to spot sometimes from the inside, isn't it? So one thing I would say, if I'm going to think about, because I usually get pitched into it, it's hard, I probably make terrible mistakes. But if you've got time to think and prepare, if you write things out as well, then think about when you've done it. If a person comes in who's not used to church, is there anything I've written down there that they're just not going to get? It's just actually got too many in words. It's a simple sort of test. Lists of names. Here it is. So I accept that some people will feel we must include the lists of names because we've said we'll pray for them and it shows care. But I'd argue that actually those lists of names, like we have in our weekly bulletins and stuff, are far more appropriate in other contexts like prayer chains than they are in public worship, first of all. And secondly, there's a danger. There's a massive danger in lists of names, which is the person you've forgotten. And then instead of it coming across as care, it comes across as exactly the opposite. And there's that thing at the end of a meeting, I'd just like to thank so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. And you think, yeah, I've done them all. And you haven't. You've missed one person or 2 people out. And it's just a disaster. So personally, I don't like lists of names in public worship. I'd rather have a silence and allow people to say names aloud or in their hearts as they wish. But you might not agree with me on that. That's fair enough. how do we encourage other people to be involved? I've already said this. I find it very sad when they tell me there's nobody. John Wesley said, any Christian should always be ready to preach, pray, or die. I love his bluntness, don't you? But, 3 things that he thought you should always be able to do as a Christian. That was probably only one of them that a lot of people would think they are able to do. So how do we change this? First of all, be a son or daughter of encouragement. Be a Barnabas. Help people. When people, if you're trying to get alongside somebody, say to them, "Yeah, you could do this. I'm sure you could do this." We've already looked at part of the issue is it's what they've seen, what they've observed us do, will definitely influence whether they feel they can do it. So we need to think carefully about what we're modelling. Are there ways we can make leading intercessions more accessible? So here's a few simple ones. Can people lead from the back rather than the front? If you're using microphones, they don't have to be there in the limelight, sweating away with people looking at them. I've seen people lead intercessions from elsewhere, or with a roving mic, or from a wheelchair. We've had one lady in our church who's done intercessions seated in a wheelchair before, and why not? Can you give them a simple form or pattern to start with? I've seen people definitely given, in the old, I think it was probably the old ASB, you pray, and it's in the liturgy, and you pray for the church and the world, and, da-da-da-da-da. Just to write out a simple thing and say, well, look, there's your kind of template to get you going, and then just populate it with things. And they might say, oh, what things? And you can give them ideas. It's not difficult to do, but it just gives them that confidence. And then let them give it a try. I think one of the fears that holds people back from doing intercessions is they think, if I go up there once, that's 50 years. That's 50 years service. Because all the people who are doing it at the moment have been doing it for 50 years. And that's what they're worried about. So can you say to them, just, give it a go for 2 or 3 months. See how you feel. And then be a Barnabas again. Keep encouraging them. Don't give them, 8 out of 10 scorecards at the back. But just say to them, oh, that was great. I loved the way you included X or Y. And there might be times when, their theology's a bit ropey, or there's other stuff that they kind of missed, or it was all a bit. But just try and find ways of encouraging them and say, oh, have you thought about X? So it's. I think those are some things that might help. I'm not saying they'll solve everything, but maybe they'll help a bit. Yeah.
We had 2 people who preached together last Sunday. Have you ever come across, does it often happen other than an adult and a child? You get 2 adults
doing the prayers together.
Sessions together. Yeah. I've never thought of that actually.
That's a great.
Here, I'm thinking, well,
yeah, why not? Yeah.
To get someone started.
Yeah. Yeah.
Quite to do on our road to which our husband and wife and people, and they come
yeah.
up and they do it together. So it is quite a few of us that are always 2 people who do the sessions. They often do it of a verse and a verse or a call and response or something, and they do it together.
Yeah.
And has it been intentionally somebody who's never done it before doing it? I mean, this just sort of happened.
Yeah.
I think some of those it's where people slowly were encouraged, like during lockdown when we were recording it all and stuff as well, that people were just doing it in their own home. And confidence to kind of and do it. But yeah.
That's very good. Yeah, that's a really good idea. I've seen families do it, but generally it's been families or nothing. But and I have done sort of tag preaching with people as well.
But tag praying. So.
Yeah, that's different. We did a remembrance service once where the other guy who preached was a pacifist, and I mean I don't hold strongly to either position, but I preached on the case for why there are times when we have to go to war. And so each of us put up a case and then critiqued the other, and then we took questions. It was quite a scary service to do, because you're thinking, well, there's going to be people who could possibly find this offensive. Although the ones that we thought would be there, the ones that we thought that might be true of, we thought wouldn't be there. Blow me, they came. But they actually found it quite helpful. But you don't see a lot of that either. And, we need to be more imaginative at times. So this is sort of end of part one. If there's any questions on that, obviously it's been one or two as we've gone along, which is fair.
Is it worth brewing up another pot of coffee, is my question. Raise a hand if you'd like a coffee in the break.
1, 2, 3. You definitely got enough for a coffee, Bill. Are there any of...
Questions.
Yeah.
I wanted to go on the don'ts, I think. One of the things I have, when people do try and use a different call and response.
Yeah.
And then they have that hiccup where they use those words within the prayer.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Oh, yes, it's time to say it.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it was something to do with Lord. So every time they say Lord, somebody is going to
Yeah.
chaotic, and then you get that, then you stop trying to say it. Because
I know. I know.
Or goes pear-shaped.
Yeah, it's true. Actually, one of the things I would say about call and response is, again, it's not a hard and fast rule and people need to do it either way. But generally, I do find interspersing prayers with Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer, or whatever, helpful. So we've got 1 or 2 people at church who just pray. That's it. They launch off and it's Amen at the end, and that's it. And you think, well, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But in a way, it's harder to sustain your concentration and engagement, isn't it? So I
was once invited to a Pentecostal church with some friends.
Only once.
The prayers that were said, and like you said, it was just a continuous spewing out of.
Yeah.
You have to think what we're praying for, and so on. Yeah. And I thought that was very, very difficult to try to follow. It was just a continuous. It was just concluded by the close of prayer, and you try to pick up.
Yeah.
What has been said.
But then,
no break in between.
No, but then that's in a different tradition. So when I was a vicar in Southall, we had a Black Pentecostal church that used our church, and we used to go and meet with them. And it is full on, but it's terrific. But that's their tradition. But when you're in an Anglican service, it seems to work quite well to split the prayers up and invite that engagement, I think.
In a sense, it does what silence does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it punctuates. Yeah.
And to sort of absorb,
gather
your thoughts.
Yeah.
If you, as the intercessor,
are
there representing people to God, then there needs to be input by them with the call and response thing.
Yes, I think that's a good way of thinking of it. Yeah. I mean, I suppose the other person will say they are inviting them to pray. It's just they're only really getting one chance to show that, which feels to me not quite enough personally. But it's horses for courses and tastes, isn't it? While he's brewing up the coffee, do we need to pick up some of the others here? So have we covered sort of relevance and content a bit? Use the news, think about diocesan resources and other things that are going on. And then the only balance to that is the comment that was made that there's just so many things we could pray for. So one of the ways of handling that is when you get to praying for the world, you can, for example, encourage people to say, let's just hold a few moments of quiet and think of one country or one situation that's on your mind at the moment in this country, for example, and just spend 30 seconds praying for that. And then in a sense, you don't know what's been prayed, but that doesn't matter. God does. And a whole load of things have been covered without you having to do 10 minutes on that section, which would probably get you into trouble. So that might be one way of tackling that. Duration, I don't know, what do people think? How long do your intercessions last? Ours vary a lot. I mean, I go to different churches, and when I'm at Bramley, they do vary quite a bit. And I'd never knock the people who pray for a long time because I genuinely believe, you know, first of all, let's make intercession for the world. So, but sometimes you are thinking, oh dear, I wish I'd preached less long. But how long do you have? 5 minutes? 10 minutes?
No, not that long.
It depends where it comes in the service.
Right.
Because if the sermon's been too long, you know, and you sense that when intercessions people are actually looking at their watches, then I think doing the intercessions has to be sensitive to that.
Yeah.
If the intercessions are at the beginning, then that's fine. It can be as long as they like.
Yeah.
But, you know, if people are expecting 1 hour and 10 minutes,
yeah,
and you're already up to 1 hour 15 minutes. And if you're leading the service and somebody is going on and you're thinking, please look at your watch, please look at the congregation.
Yeah. So that is a bit of a felt issue for people. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's something like you say when somebody does see it as their almost like a mini sermon, or they start.
Yeah.
Or they, I mean, and it's beautiful when prayers are linked biblically, but then when there's a bit like there's a whole heap of stuff first, and you can just feel that kind of resentment builds up. So people then aren't really in a place where they're open to praying at that point. They're frustrated, and so I think that makes a difference in timing. If the timing is, if it's a really beautiful time of prayer, then actually it can be quite a longish time, but it won't feel long because it's very beautifully done. Whereas if it's not, it can be really quite difficult, I think, to sit through.
It's tricky, isn't it? Yeah. We've occasionally had people who've come up who they've obviously got what they're going to pray, but something has spoken to them in the sermon, and so they say something before they pray. And I don't mind that at all, and sometimes it's quite profound, but obviously it does impact the time that they're at the front, or they may have come with a picture or something that's something else. And again, you think, well, I don't want to knock that, I don't want to squash the work of the Spirit, but it's sometimes, it's that sensitivity. Refrains we've looked at, haven't we? Different cultures, that didn't come up really. I mean, that's tricky. When I was in Southall, we were 40. So I've been a minister of a majority non-white congregation. Hey, that makes me really switched on for these days, doesn't it? So 40% West Indian, Caribbean, 20% Asian, and 40% white, and that definitely impacted the way prayers were done. Quite a few of our West Indians led prayers, and they were long, and they were very heartfelt, and they were excellent, to be honest. And I just used to enjoy them, to be perfectly honest. And I think if we're going to make space for people from different cultures, then we've got to actually educate people who aren't from those cultures to appreciate the strengths of what there is, even if it's not what they're used to. So it's probably, if you've got it, it's a great thing to rejoice in. But you may have to do a little bit of work with people who get a bit edgy and just say to them, look, try and see what's strong here, what's good here, and just try and make sure they don't, go and give the people an ear bashing.
So, there'll be different cultures along ethnic lines, but there'll be different cultures in terms of that particular church tradition.
Yeah, church traditions as well, yeah.
So I think in terms of being sensitive and if you're going into a different church in particular, which you don't know, maybe trying to suss out where they come from, and be able to tailor the way you might
absolutely,
prayers, how you might do it there.
Yeah, but it's but in a way, hopefully, I hope this is a problem we have more of a problem with, actually working out how we wrestle with, and then that it doesn't become a problem anymore, because it would show that we have grown. Theology, it's tricky, isn't it? How to unless it's really off the wall, I think you just have to let it go. I mean, there have been prayers I've not said amen to in some churches. So, because I've thought, no, I can't really say amen to that. But it's not so off the wall that I feel I'm going to go and complain. But it's, yeah, I mean, that's sort of quite a tricky one, really.
Something you might have a just chat afterwards over coffee. I found that prayer difficult because, so it's not accusing
you could, yeah.
Accusing you, but I found it difficult because, and that's my story of how it impacted me.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I mean, I suppose if you had a lot of people having an issue with the way a certain person prayed, perhaps they wouldn't stay on a rota very long. Would be one way of handling that, wouldn't it? Yeah, I don't know, slightly tricky. Have we tackled some of the reluctance issues? List of names, we definitely did. Silence, I think, is great. Written, so I mean, I answered that at the time, really. I think there's nothing wrong with either. If that's what the person can manage, that's brilliant. I don't think we should decry written prayers as not being, quite so in the moment or in the spirit, because probably, certainly as the one person who I know who definitely writes their prayers in advance, really, crafts them. And again, not as a performance. You don't sense that person's thinking, if I write these words, people are going to think, whoa, really impressive. They're actually thinking about how can they talk to God in the most imaginative way and help people to go there with them. That's how I feel it is, anyway. Denise.
We were talking about different cultures and things like that. And within our culture, I picked up on the word silence. We've had a few deaf coming to
yes.
And been signing for them. And the best way to lose their focus is to have a silence.
Good point, yeah.
As soon as there's a silence, the deaf they don't.
They think, what's happening? Yeah.
What's happening? Why is it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the hard of hearing.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah. Is there, I mean, just to turn the question back, is there a good way that we could help people from the deaf community to engage in leading us in prayer at all, or is that not really a realistic act?
Yes.
Be helpful to get your thoughts, really.
Yes, but I think they'd have to be prepared beforehand, because the vocabulary is not the same, and just like we were saying earlier, certain words, paraclete, things like that.
Yeah.
It's not in their vocabulary.
Yeah.
So it would have to be. They tend to be heartfelt, like some of the other cultures, and they often have thought about it beforehand. They adapt them as they're going along. But we'd certainly have to bear their needs in mind. It would be like anybody with special needs, for example, if you're involved, or if you involve children, you've got to. You've got to sort of allow for the fact that, they would do it differently.
Yeah.
Because they're children.
Yeah. Okay. While we were waiting for the coffee to brew, but I put down on here what insights do you bring, because I put on one of the earlier slides the wisdom of the room. I'm not an expert in leading intercessions. I happily speak on it and got some ideas, I hope. But there may be, you may have been sitting there thinking, well, I could have done loads better than that. So if there are any other things or things you bring from perhaps a different tradition, might just be useful to pick up some of those. And then the other main thing in the second bit is doing a practical exercise. So the more questions you ask, the less work you've got to do. No, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't give you that hint. The more questions you ask, the less time you've got to do your exercise. But are there any things that you wanted to bring? You think, oh, we've done this, or this has been helpful, because there may just be other stuff in the room,
One of the things that one of our worshippers who was on the prayer rota, he's very, very, very good at saying prayers through poetry.
Okay.
Very good at saying prayers.
Through poems, yeah. Yeah.
And he's very popular in the congregation.
Right.
To hear his poems. Do you know what I'm talking about, Peter?
No.
No. I'm sorry, Peter, no. But it's very, very good at saying a lot of his prayer content. He writes poetry anyway.
Yeah, I thought you meant you were at Peter's Church, in which case I would have guessed it was Ron Town. But there we are.
He's very good at composing prayers in poems.
Right.
And people like that is totally different.
Yeah.
But the prayers are always very, very meaningful, quite often around current events.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just something that
Okay. Yeah. I can see that could be a good thing and also potentially a difficult thing, because it could put people like, I think, oh, I definitely can't do that. I mean, if you had to do that, I would be out. I can't write poems.
I sometimes use other people's poems. I mean,
true.
Malcolm
Guyte,
Malcolm Guyte, writes these 14-line sonnets, which are just very rich.
Yeah. So, but yeah, that's perfectly all right. Denise.
One of our churches has sort of an older congregation, and there's not that many of them. I think a lot of parishes have one of those such churches.
Yep.
And it's not the fact that they can't come up and say a prayer or something, but it's very often that they have to have a prompt, a subject or something. And so the subject being it's prayer time, sometimes tagged on to the end of intercessions or something, I find we put a Barnabas spot, and I find that encourages them. The Barnabas spot is, have a think about what we've been praying about. Now, would you like to come forward and either talk about or pray for something that's linked with that, or talk about something wonderful that's happened to you in the last week or 2 weeks that you want to share with us, and we can turn that into a prayer. That seems to work very well with older people who wouldn't willingly just stand up and come, but you know, they will share with you.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Go on.
One of the things I started to do when I first started interceding was, it had always struck me that sometimes the intercessions bore no relation to the rest of the service. And that, I mean, it comes back to relevance and content, really.
Yeah.
But that I've noticed that when people managed to create some structure that related to the rest of the service, it was far more meaningful.
Yes.
So, as a general practice, I look at the service in its entirety from the order of service, because we get that in advance. So I know what the reading is, I know what the content is likely to be.
Yeah.
So I can make a informed. Well, I can work out where I'm going. That my mind is going. It may not be where the preacher's going, but it quite often is. And then try and structure something that has links to it.
Yeah.
Because then you find that people come back at the end of the service and say, I appreciated that because it felt like a coherent whole, rather than you know.
Yeah. I think that's really good. So a couple of comments to make on that, Ray. Come and sit down again. If you're happy to do so. When I'm producing, so at the moment, I tend to have to produce the whole service for when I'm at Bramley. But I always write down round an email at the beginning of the week to all the people who are on the rota saying this is where we're going with this. This is what I'm trying to produce. So it means that the person doing the intercessions, they're reminded of what the readings are, and they also know what my theme is. So that's, in a way, that's more the responsibility then of the overall service leader or preacher or whoever to actually bother to inform the person doing the intercessions. And then the other thing I would say is one of the things I feel I learned more by doing than at college is that crucial to making a service that works really well is what I call flow. Does the whole thing hang together? And so often, you know, you go to a service and it just feels bitty and you think, well, what was that about? So, you know, somebody needed to get hold of that and actually shape it up better and think through how it held together. So I think the point you're making is really good one. But I think even just by reading the readings and realising what the theme that week is, you can probably guess the shape of what's happening and get your intercessions roughly around where the rest of it is. So that's a really good insight. Thank you.
And if you know the preacher, you could maybe just drop them a line.
You could talk to them, yeah.
Any pointers towards my prayers on Sunday, you let me know.
You could, yeah. Yeah. It'll depend then whether you've got the sort of person who actually produces it Saturday night, or whether they've already got an idea way in advance or not. So we have one or two lay preachers who, because they don't preach very often, they probably know a month ahead what they're going to do, pretty much, because that's the way they work. Yeah. Go on.
Have you ever helped people to prepare leading intercessions by using a college format? I remember some years ago I was running a group for 11, 12 and 13-year-olds, and I wanted them to think what it was they were going to ask God about, why it was therefore, what it was about God that meant that he would be particularly interested in that subject. And then we finished with the Trinitarian bit at the end. They really couldn't get their head around it. It was a bit too ambitious. But do you ever use a collect to shape intercessions?
I haven't, but I can see that collect could work. I mean, in a sense, the collect depends which one you use. I often use the short one because I find the other ones sometimes are a bit verbose, really, aren't they? Sorry, that's me again. But they do. Either of them should pick up that week's theme quite well in one way or another. So they should give you kind of links to the readings, so they ought to be quite helpful for the intercessions. But
I did the intercessions at the AGM a couple of weeks ago, and there was a phrase that I can't remember what it was now in the collect, something about being exceptionally good or something.
Mr.
Like
Kipling, is it? Oh, no.
Well, God is exceedingly.
Indeed.
And I use that phrase doing the intercession because it's a bit unnerving doing the intercessions with all the other readers present, you know. And I've never before thought about actually using a collect in intercessions, and I've thought about it much since. But I just wondered if anybody else had actually used the format of a collect when leading.
Doesn't seem like it, but they'll all be going away and thinking about it now.
Some of the collects are great sort of standalone prayers, but you were talking about flow, and I find it very difficult to see how the collects fit into the flow, especially now that the subject matter of the collects has become uncoupled from the passages in the lectionary, and therefore the content of the rest of the service. But I understand the point of the collect was the old Benedictines kind of collecting together spoken and unspoken intercessions into a single set of words. But then in the communion service, you put the collect right at the beginning, which seems a bizarre place to put it.
I know.
So the collect becomes a bit redundant for me, although individually I can see there's some great things there.
Yeah.
You don't have to put it in that position, though. You can move it around.
I do, and when I use the collect, I tend to put it towards the end of the prayers, but even then, it's not collecting the prayers, the intercessions that I've just been offering, because it's come from another place.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we better move on from collects. we were just... Go on, a couple more, and then we'll move on to your exercise, I think. Sian first.
I was just going to say, I've got a really good book, and it's just called The Intercessions Handbook, and it's by John Pritchard. Loads of you have probably seen it, but I love using the other ways of praying. So there's like, you do circular, so Lord, and it's like you've dropped a pebble into the pond, and the first circle you pray about is your close family, and the second pebble in the pond, and just go out and out and out, and then just leaving space for people to pray for the people they think of in that circle of.
It's good,
prayer. I really like that one. It's a brilliant book, though.
And then last one at the back for now.
We had a service a couple of weeks ago where the children's worker was on holiday, so the children didn't go after the service where they would usually. So that was one of those things, just thinking through how are they going to to it. So actually what we did is we got the children to blow bubbles through it. So the prayers were still the prayers that linked to the service and the words, but the children were all blowing bubbles and then people had an opportunity to see it. It was one of those things I wasn't quite sure whether people would start popping it, it'd all go a bit, but it didn't. It was very nice, and it did mean the children had a bit where they could properly contribute to the...
Oh, that's really good. Somebody said to me in the break about the incense idea, you know, that in the biblical picture it was of the prayers rising, so that the bubbles would work quite well for that in our modern context, unless you've still got your incense. But, that's good. All right, well, I'm going to move on. My exercise, so I'll put it up here and then we'll return to it in a moment because I want to say something else first. I thought we could have a look at doing some harvest intercessions. I thought that if we look a little bit ahead, it's a different sort of event. So in groups of, I've put in groups of 3 or 4 people or on your own. You're not forced to be in a group if you hate working with other people. When you might say, well, I'm going to have to do it on my own anyway. Just to think about how you would produce a set of harvest intercessions. If you've got a phone or something with you, you can always have a quick look online. Some of you will be going, oh, that's easier said than done. I don't do all this stuff. But a lot of you, I'm sure, are much more capable of doing it than that. You can just do a quick Google search. You can relate it to traditional harvest themes, or you could maybe take a climate change, climate creation type of approach, and I'll say something about that in a moment. And it could be just a normal sort of adult service, or it could be all age. How long would you need for this exercise? Actually, looking at the clock, you might not get 20 minutes. 10 minutes, 15 minutes? How long would you normally have?
10.
Do you want 10 minutes? Yeah. So before, we'll come back to that in a minute. I will leave it up there as the slide. Bill had asked me to say something about praying for climate issues, and so I've made a few notes about that. I've already alluded to them in some examples as I've gone through. One of the tricky things that I was thinking about how you do this, one of the little problems is, what I said earlier, the intercessions are directed towards God. They're not preaching opportunities. So if you take an issue like this, how do you avoid it becoming a preaching opportunity? It's no good making pointed remarks as prayers. So you might think, well, should I just avoid the subject? Should I not do it at all? And if you're thinking that, I came across this quote from an environmental lawyer, Gus Speth, just last week. He said, I used to think that the top environmental issues were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and a cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. I thought that was a really interesting comment. So when we're thinking about climate and the world, it's a spiritual issue, and therefore it's a perfectly valid issue for our prayers. In fact, you could argue that's the only place we're really going to perhaps begin to change those underlying attitudes. So I would suggest 2 things really, it's a both and. The first thing is actually bringing these things into your intercessions regularly, just as part of the drip, drip, drip of making people aware. There are always climate issues in the news. And if you use the news stories, you can simply use the facts and pray for the issues that are involved and pray for the people who are caught up in them. So, for example, every time there's a what do they call it? COP, something of the parties, Conference of the Parties event. Pray for it. Pray that it'll actually do some good and that people will follow up the things they commit to, for example. When there are extreme weather events, not difficult to pray for those, is it? Because very often they affect people's lives severely. Pray about decisions when there are policy events about, are we going to open a new coal mine in Cumbria, things like that. You know, those are genuine climate issues. And when there isn't a story, you've still got things to pray for, like our own diocesan commitment to net zero by 2030, which is a challenging target given the sort of buildings we occupy. And the number of churches that are trying to become eco-churches. So there's always things you can pray for. And you might think, well, I don't want to do that every week, because otherwise you might have people in your congregation who are not convinced, and it will start giving you a hard time. And there are lots of other things to pray for, but again, it's not something to avoid. I think we can regularly have these in. But then the alternative, or the other thing, is to have a climate Sunday. So there's a couple of obvious opportunities in the year for that. There is Environmental Sunday. If you're wondering when that is, you've just missed it. It's 4th of June this year. But there's also Harvest. And I think Harvest is a good opportunity. So that's why I brought it in at this point. If you're thinking about prayers for Harvest, you might think, well, do we want to go down that line? And you've got songs that fit as well. I think of the children's songs. Think of a world without any flowers. I mean, that's a pretty mournful title, isn't it, for starters? But it's showing what happens if we don't take care of the world. It's quite a provocative thing. And again, there's lots of resources on climate stuff. Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, Climate Coalition, Arosha, and the Church of England's Season of Creation resources. There's loads of things that you can get hold of if you want to create a service with that kind of theme. But I think if you use the news stories, because you might think, oh, I'm not very confident about, I've got to get my facts right. I don't understand the science or whatever. I'm a scientist. I know quite a lot about climate science. That's not my field, but it's relatively easy for me. But you might think, oh, I know, I might get it all wrong and then I'll get shot down. Just use the stories that are there and don't overstep yourself. Don't try and sort of make up stuff. So with that in mind, Harvest Intercessions. If you want to break into groups and think about what you might want to do, is there any group of people who want to have a go at all age, first of all, any individuals who'd like to, and then they can get together as a group? You don't have to, but it'd just be useful. You might be dotted on the wrong tables, as it were. No, not getting a great clamour for that one. So do you want to get into 3s or 4s? And we'll give you 10 minutes to have a look at that. So 8:45, and then we'll take a little bit of feedback.
Yeah,